In 633, Khalid ibn al-Walid moved toward the Sassanid frontier in Lower Iraq, and a Persian commander, known in later Muslim chronicles as Hormuz, moved to block him. The encounter later became associated with Kazima and with the name Dhat al-Salasil, the Battle of the Chains. But even the famous chains are uncertain. Later Arabic accounts describe Persian troops linked together in formation. Modern historians cannot confirm that this was a general Sassanid battlefield practice, or even that the description is literal. What is less uncertain is the strategic problem. Khalid was not approaching an isolated province. He was entering a frontier connected to the Sassanid imperial system. Garrisons, tax districts, Arab allies, river routes, agricultural settlements, and roads leading deeper into Mesopotamia. Hormuz therefore faced a containment problem. If Khalid could be stopped near the edge of Iraq, the crisis might remain local. If he could not, Persia would have to escalate. The campaign began only after Medina had survived a far more immediate crisis inside Arabia. Following the death of Muhammad in 632, Abu Bakr became the first caliph. His government quickly faced rebellions, political defections, disputes over taxation, and rival prophetic movements across much of the Arabian Peninsula. The conflicts collectively remembered as the Ridda Wars were not one simple uprising. Different tribes resisted Medina for different reasons, and later Islamic sources sometimes compress those conflicts into a cleaner narrative than the political reality probably was. Militarily, however, the consequence was clear. By the end of the campaigns, Abu Bakr possessed forces that had been fighting continuously across Arabia, and Khalid ibn al-Walid had emerged as one of the most effective commanders available to him. The strategic question now changed. Medina no longer needed to concentrate all available strength on preventing political fragmentation inside Arabia. Forces could be redirected outward, and Iraq presented both an opportunity and a danger. The region along the lower Euphrates and the approaches to the Persian Gulf was economically significant. Southern Mesopotamia contained irrigated agricultural land, established settlements, trade routes, and access to waterways connecting the interior with the Gulf. It was also politically complex. Arab tribal communities lived on both sides of an imperial boundary that was never as simple as a modern national border. For generations, the Sassanids had managed parts of this frontier through combinations of direct military presence, taxation, local elites, and Arab client relationships. The destruction of the Lakhmid kingdom at al-Hira by the Sassanid ruler Khosrow II in the early 7th century had already altered one of the older political mechanisms through which Persia had managed its Arabian approaches. That mattered in 633. Khalid was not crossing from one clearly defined state into another through a single fortified border gate. He was moving into a zone where imperial authority depended on military posts, allied communities, local loyalties, and the ability of Sassanid commanders to respond quickly when those arrangements were challenged. Later, Muslim historians describe Abu Bakr directing Khalid toward Iraq and portray the campaign as a deliberate offensive against Persian power. The exact wording of orders recorded generations afterward cannot be treated like contemporary military documentation, but the sequence of operations strongly indicates that the move was more than an accidental border clash. Khalid entered the Iraqi frontier with an organized force and continued campaigning after the first engagement. His operational advantages were significant. The army coming out of the Ridda Wars was accustomed to rapid movement over long distances, and to fighting in environments where water, grazing, supply, and tribal cooperation could determine whether a force remained mobile. Khalid also operated closer to Arabian support networks than the Sassanid field armies did. But those advantages should not be exaggerated. The Sassanid Empire remained one of the major military powers of the 7th century. It controlled the core of Mesopotamia and Iran, maintained professional cavalry traditions, drew revenue from one of the richest agricultural regions in Western Asia, and could still assemble additional armies after local defeats. Khalid was therefore entering a theater in which tactical success could easily produce a larger strategic response. There was another complication. The Persia confronting him in 633 was not the Persia that had begun the Great War against Byzantium a generation earlier. For more than 2 decades, the Sassanid and Byzantine empires had exhausted each other in a conflict that reached from Egypt and Syria to Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Persian armies had once occupied Jerusalem and Egypt and threatened the Byzantine heartland. Then Emperor Heraclius reversed the war, invading Sassanid territory and helping produce a political crisis that ended with the overthrow and death of Khosrow II in 628. What followed was a rapid succession of rulers and intense internal instability. That did not make the frontier undefended. It made the quality and speed of imperial coordination harder to predict. The first test came through Hormuz. Later, Muslim tradition places him in command of the Persian resistance facing Khalid near the approaches to Lower Iraq. The precise location and details of the confrontation remain debated, but the strategic logic is straightforward. A Sassanid commander attempted to stop an Arabian army before it penetrated farther into imperial territory. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, tell me your city, state, or country in the comments. By the time the two forces moved toward the confrontation remembered as Kazima, the issue was no longer whether Medina would test the Iraqi frontier. It already had. The unresolved question was how quickly the Sassanid system could recognize that this was not a raid to be contained by one commander, but the beginning of a campaign that might require several armies. By 633, the Sassanid state could still raise armies, but the chain of authority directing them had been badly damaged. The crisis had begun years earlier. Khosrow II had pushed Sassanid power farther west than almost any Persian ruler before him. Persian armies occupied Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and large parts of Anatolia during the long war with Byzantium. The expansion looked decisive. It was not. Emperor Heraclius rebuilt Byzantine resistance, struck into Sassanid territory, and by 628 the political consequences inside Persia were severe enough to help bring down Khosrow himself. His removal did not restore stability. A rapid succession of rulers followed. Court factions competed for control. Members of the royal family were eliminated or displaced. Provincial elites and military commanders gained greater room to act independently. The exact scale of institutional breakdown is difficult to measure from the surviving evidence, but the succession crisis was real and prolonged. By the time Yazdegerd III became king in 632, the empire had a ruler, but not yet a fully restored political system. That distinction mattered militarily. The Sassanid army was not one centrally deployed force waiting behind the frontier. Its strength depended on aristocratic military households, regional commanders, heavily equipped cavalry, infantry formations, fortified positions, and the tax base needed to support them. In a stable political system, these elements could be coordinated. Under repeated dynastic crisis, response times and command relationships became less reliable. There were also material losses from the war with Byzantium. Decades of mobilization had consumed manpower and revenue. Mesopotamia, the economic center of the empire, had supported prolonged military operations. The end of the Byzantine War required territorial withdrawals and political reorganization rather than a simple return to pre-war conditions. Disease added another burden. A major epidemic struck the Sassanid world in the late 620s, affecting Mesopotamia and weakening populations already exposed to warfare, taxation, and disruption. It would be misleading to describe Persia in 633 as militarily exhausted beyond recovery. It was not, but the empire had far less margin for error than its territorial size suggested. The frontier with Arabia exposed those weaknesses. The Sassanids had long relied on more than regular imperial troops to manage the desert approaches. Arab client rulers and tribal alliances had helped absorb raids, monitor routes, and provide political distance between the imperial core and the peninsula. That system had already been altered before Khalid arrived. In 602, Khosrow II ended the Lakhmid monarchy at al-Hira and brought its territory under more direct Sassanid administration. The reasons remain debated, but the strategic consequence was important. One of Persia's established Arab buffer structures had been removed. Direct rule offered greater control when the center was strong. It could become a liability when the center was unstable. Now, as forces from Medina approached Iraq, the Sassanids had to defend a frontier whose older political architecture had been weakened while the imperial government itself was still recovering from internal crisis. This did not mean Arab communities in Iraq automatically supported Khalid. Loyalties were local and varied. Some groups remained connected to Persian authority. Others had their own interests. Religious communities, landholders, tribal leaders, agricultural populations, and town elites faced decisions that later conquest narratives often reduced to simple categories of resistance or submission. For civilians, those decisions had immediate consequences. Military movement meant requisitioning, interrupted trade, pressure on food supplies, and exposure to whichever authority controlled the area at a given moment. Frontier populations could be taxed by one power, threatened by another, and forced to renegotiate political survival as armies moved through the region. For Persian commanders, the problem was operational. They could not assume that every local alliance would hold if imperial forces suffered an early defeat, and they could not afford to allow Khalid's army unrestricted access to the lower Iraqi routes. Later, Muslim accounts identify Hormuz as the commander who took responsibility for that first containment effort. His exact title and command structure are uncertain, but the tradition consistently places him at the head of the force assembled to meet Khalid. The next stage was therefore no longer a question of imperial weakness in the abstract. A Sassanid field commander was moving troops into position. The frontier crisis was becoming a battle plan. Hormuz now had to convert imperial authority into a field force before Khalid could move beyond the frontier zone. Later, Muslim chronicles place Hormuz in command around the approaches to al-Ubula, near the head of the Persian Gulf, where Sassanid interests were tied to maritime trade, river access, taxation, and communications with Lower Mesopotamia. His precise rank is uncertain, and the surviving narrative depends heavily on much later Arabic accounts. What those accounts preserve with greater consistency is his function. He was the commander expected to intercept Khalid before the Arabian advance became a deeper penetration into Iraq. The size of the forces cannot be established securely. One later tradition gives Khalid roughly 18,000 men, but numerical claims from early conquest narratives are often difficult to verify and should not be treated as administrative returns. Persian troop figures are even less reliable. The engagement was probably smaller than later popular retellings suggest, involving Sassanid troops alongside Arab forces connected to Persian authority. Khalid's immediate advantage was operational mobility. His army approached from northeastern Arabia rather than from an established imperial supply corridor. That created logistical risk, but it also complicated Persian interception. A defender protecting lower Iraq could not simply wait behind one fixed position. Roads from the Arabian interior approached several points along the frontier, while control of wells and water routes could determine where a large body of men and animals was capable of concentrating. Later accounts describe Khalid advancing through more than one column before bringing his forces together. The exact sequence is uncertain, but dispersed movement would have served a practical purpose. It reduced pressure on individual water sources and made it more difficult for Hormuz to identify the final point of concentration early enough to block it. The traditional narrative also places an important stage of the maneuver around Hufair and Kazima. According to these later accounts, Hormuz initially moved to cover one expected route, only to discover that Khalid's movement forced him to reposition. Some versions portray the Persian commander repeatedly responding to Khalid's changes of direction before the armies finally approached Kazima. The details may have been sharpened by later storytellers into a contest between a mobile commander and an inflexible opponent. The evidence does not justify reconstructing every march with confidence. The strategic principle, however, is credible. Hormuz was defending infrastructure. Khalid was attacking freedom of movement. The Sassanid commander had to protect access toward the cultivated Iraqi interior and the routes leading toward al-Ubula and the Euphrates system. Khalid needed only to find a route that allowed his army to enter the operational space before Persian forces could close it. That difference placed pressure on the defender. Hormuz could not ignore Khalid's movement without risking penetration, but every forced redeployment consumed time, supplies, and the endurance of troops expected to fight afterward. For the Arab communities living within the Persian frontier system, the approaching armies created another problem. Political loyalty was now becoming a military calculation. Groups tied to Sassanid administration could be required to provide men, intelligence, transport, or supplies. Communities farther from direct imperial control had to judge whether Persian forces could still protect them if the fighting moved inland. Later, conquest narratives often describe tribal alignment as if entire populations changed sides at once. The reality was less orderly. Frontier societies contained competing clans, local leaders, commercial interests, religious communities, and households whose immediate concern was survival under whichever armed authority controlled the roads and settlements around them. A military campaign that altered those routes could disrupt taxation, grazing, trade, and food distribution before any major city changed hands. Hormuz therefore needed more than a battlefield victory. He needed to demonstrate that Sassanid authority could still prevent an armed force from Arabia from choosing when and where it would fight. By the time both armies converged toward the area remembered as Kazima, that opportunity was narrowing. The maneuver phase was ending. Hormuz had assembled a force capable of blocking further movement, while Khalid had brought his army close enough that continued advance would require direct confrontation. The next problem was no longer where the armies would move. It was how each commander would deploy once movement stopped. Once the armies were close enough to deploy, the evidence becomes more difficult, not less. The detailed account of Kazima survives mainly through later Muslim historical tradition, especially material attributed to Saif ibn Umar and preserved by al-Tabari. That tradition places the confrontation near Dhat al-Salasil, close to al-Ubula in southern Iraq, and describes Hormuz forming a Sassanid force to block Khalid's advance. But historians have long questioned Saif's reliability, and the earliest surviving non-Muslim narrative of the Arab conquests does not describe Khalid in this particular engagement. The battle may preserve a real frontier clash, whose details were later expanded. Some scholars have questioned whether the conventional narrative can be reconstructed at all with confidence. That uncertainty is especially important when examining the famous Persian formation. Later chroniclers associated the engagement with troops fastened together by chains. This is the origin of the name Dhat al-Salasil, usually translated as the Battle of the Chains. The traditional explanation is simple. Persian infantry were physically linked together to prevent retreat and stabilize the formation. It is also one of the least secure details in the story. There is insufficient evidence to conclude that the Sassanid army routinely chained entire formations together in battle. The account could preserve a limited tactical arrangement, describe groups bound or connected in some other way, or reflect a later literary image emphasizing Persian rigidity. It should not be treated as a verified description of the entire Sassanid line. The same caution applies to the named Persian commanders placed alongside Hormuz. Later accounts identify Qubad and Anushajan as officers controlling sections of the Sassanid army. Their roles are difficult to confirm independently. What can be reconstructed more safely is the military requirement facing Hormuz. His force needed a formation capable of holding ground and denying Khalid further access toward lower Mesopotamia. Sassanid armies traditionally relied heavily on disciplined cavalry forces supported by infantry, but the composition of this particular frontier army is unknown. It may also have incorporated Arab auxiliaries or local troops serving Persian interests. Khalid faced a different requirement. He needed to break the blocking force without losing the mobility that had allowed him to reach the Iraqi frontier in the first place. A prolonged engagement near Persian-controlled territory carried obvious risks. Sassanid reinforcements could potentially be drawn from deeper inside Iraq, while an army operating from Arabia could not assume unlimited supplies. Water therefore appears repeatedly in the traditional account. Some versions state that Hormuz positioned his troops near accessible water, while Khalid's army deployed at a disadvantage. They then describe Khalid ordering his men to dismount and prepare to fight for control of the position. The language attached to that episode is preserved centuries after the event and should not be mistaken for a verbatim battlefield order. But the logistical problem itself is credible. Large armies operating along the desert edge could not separate tactics from water access. Men, cavalry horses, and transport animals required dependable supply. A commander controlling a water source could force an opponent either to attack, withdraw, or shift position before exhaustion and logistical breakdown became serious. For ordinary soldiers, this meant that the battlefield was defined not only by weapons and formations, but by access to basic resources. Once deployment began, retreat could also become difficult if formations were tightly packed or if supply animals and baggage occupied the rear. The surrounding population faced another form of exposure. Any contested water source, road, cultivated settlement or storage area could be requisitioned by military forces. The surviving chronicles concentrate on commanders. They provide far less information about the communities whose food, animals, labor, and movement were affected when two armies concentrated in the same frontier district. By this stage, however, negotiation or maneuver could no longer resolve the immediate military problem. The Persian blocking force remained between Khalid and further movement into Iraq. Khalid's army had deployed against it, and according to the later Muslim narrative, the opening phase of the battle would now become unusually personal. Hormuz was said to leave the security of command and confront Khalid directly. Hormuz is said to have challenged Khalid ibn al-Walid to single combat. The same tradition states that Khalid killed him during the encounter. Some later versions add an attempted intervention by Persian soldiers and the involvement of al-Qaqa ibn Amr, but these details come from a narrative tradition whose reliability is contested. Even the report that Khalid personally killed Hormuz has been treated cautiously by modern scholarship because commander against commander combat became a recurring literary feature in accounts of the early conquests. The safest conclusion is narrower. Hormuz did not survive the engagement described by the Muslim sources, and the Persian force lost its principal frontier commander at the point when coordinated command was most important. That did not automatically decide the battle. A Sassanid formation was not dependent on one man alone. Later accounts name Anushirvan and Qubada as commanders of the two wings. Both are presented as Sassanid magnates operating within a frontier defense system that had increasingly been left to regional commanders as central authority weakened. Their presence indicates that the Persian force retained subordinate leadership even after Hormuz was removed. What followed is much less securely documented than popular military retellings suggest. Traditional accounts describe Khalid ordering a general attack after Hormuz's death. They present the Muslim force pressing the Persian center while the wings came under increasing pressure. They also claim that the supposed chains linking Persian infantry made withdrawal difficult once the formation began to fail. That explanation cannot be accepted at face value. The claim that Persian troops had been chained together specifically to prevent retreat is probably a later fabrication. There is evidence that Sasanian military theory knew defensive devices involving iron obstacles, particularly against surprise attacks, but that is not the same as proving that large numbers of soldiers at Kazima fought physically chained to one another. The battle should therefore be understood without depending on that image. A local Sassanid force attempted to block Khalid near the southern Iraqi frontier. Its commander was lost. Its defensive position failed. The surviving leadership withdrew, rather than allowing the entire field force to be destroyed. Later tradition identifies Anushirvan and Kubad among those who escaped. That withdrawal was militarily rational. Once the line could no longer hold, preserving cavalry, officers, and surviving troops offered the Sassanids a chance to combine them with additional forces farther inside Iraq. Remaining in a collapsing position would have risked losing men that the frontier command could not easily replace. For the defeated soldiers, withdrawal carried its own dangers. Organized formations could separate under pressure. Wounded men, infantry unable to keep pace, transport personnel, and anyone cut off from the retreat route faced capture or death. The surviving sources are interested primarily in commanders and victory. They provide no dependable accounting of the ordinary Persian troops who disappeared from the record after the battle. Nor can the casualty totals sometimes attached to Kazima be treated as reliable. Early conquest narratives regularly transmit large, rounded enemy losses while giving far less precise information about the victorious army. There is no contemporary record that allows a secure reconstruction of the number killed, captured, or dispersed here. The strategic result requires no inflated figure. Hormuz had attempted to stop Khalid near the edge of Sassanid-controlled Iraq. He failed. But this was not the destruction of Persian resistance. It forced the defense farther inland. The surviving Persian commanders moved toward Madhar on the Euphrates system, where the Sassanids could assemble another force and incorporate survivors from the first defeat. Iranika's reconstruction specifically places Anushirvan and Kubad among those who escaped there before another confrontation followed. Khalid had broken the first blocking force. He had not broken the Sassanid capacity to replace it. The next military problem was already forming at Madhar. With Hormuz's force broken, the immediate military problem changed. Khalid no longer had to force an entry through the first Sassanid position. He now had to exploit the breach before the defenders could rebuild it. According to the later Muslim narrative, two Persian commanders associated with Hormuz's army, Kubad and Anushirvan, escaped with surviving troops toward Madhar in Maysan. Their retreat mattered because the defeat near Kazima had not destroyed the Sassanid capacity to resist. It had displaced that resistance farther inside Lower Mesopotamia. Reinforcements were also being sent from al-Madarin, the Sassanid capital complex on the Tigris. This was the strategic consequence of the first battle. A local frontier commander had failed, but the imperial system behind him was beginning to react. Khalid therefore continued into Maysan, rather than remaining near the coastal approaches. This brought his forces closer to the irrigated districts of southern Iraq, where movement was constrained by rivers, canals, marshes, cultivated land, and established settlements. The operational environment was changing. The open approaches from northeastern Arabia were giving way to a region in which waterways and agricultural infrastructure increasingly controlled military routes. For the defenders, this created both advantages and vulnerabilities. A Sassanid force operating inside Iraq could draw closer to major population centers and imperial communications. Reinforcements could move from al-Madain. Local administrators and landholders could provide information, provisions, transport, and access to established routes. But those same systems could be disrupted when the defending army lost control of key corridors. Later accounts place the next major engagement at Madhar, where survivors from Hormuz's force combined with additional troops sent from the interior. The chronology and precise composition of the armies remain uncertain, but the sequence recorded in the conquest tradition is consistent on one central point. The Sassanids did not accept the first defeat as decisive. Another force was assembled quickly enough to contest Khalid's advance. The result, according to those accounts, was another Persian defeat. That second setback carried greater strategic weight than the first. At Kazima, Sassanid authorities could still treat the problem as a failed frontier containment operation. At Madhar, forces connected more directly to the imperial interior had also been committed. The defensive problem was moving north and west with Khalid. The surviving evidence gives far more attention to commanders than to the population caught inside this movement. Maysan was not empty ground between battle sites. It was an inhabited agricultural district whose productivity depended on irrigation, labor, storage, livestock, and functioning transport networks. Armies moving through such territory required food and animals. Control could also bring taxation, tribute demands, confiscation, and pressure on local elites to cooperate with whichever force held the immediate advantage. Later Muslim sources also describe operations against al-Ubullah after the initial breakthrough. The details are contested, and the entire early sequence depends heavily on narratives written well after the events. What can be stated more cautiously is that Sassanid control near the head of the Persian Gulf had become less secure once the first defensive positions were penetrated. Khalid then altered the direction of the campaign. Instead of driving directly toward al-Madain, his forces moved westward and north of the marshlands toward the territory of Kaskar. This was strategically significant. The campaign was expanding away from a single penetration route. The Sassanids now had to defend several connected zones while determining where Khalid intended to concentrate next. They did respond. Another Persian-led force was forming around Walaja, reinforced by Arab allies and troops drawn into the defense of the Sawad. The frontier had not collapsed completely, but it was no longer holding Khalid at its edge. At Walaja, the Sassanid response became broader. Later, Muslim accounts describe a combined Persian and Arab force assembling in the Kaskar region to oppose Khalid. This was no longer the attempt of a single frontier commander to contain an incursion near the Gulf. Troops and allied forces were being drawn into a defensive effort across southern Iraq, while Khalid continued changing the direction of his advance rather than moving directly toward the Sassanid capital. The detailed tactical narrative of Walaja comes from later Islamic sources and cannot be reconstructed with the certainty sometimes claimed in popular accounts. The traditional version describes Khalid concealing cavalry detachments and using them against the Persian rear during the decisive stage of the battle. Whether every element occurred exactly as later chroniclers describe is uncertain. The strategic outcome is clearer. The force assembled at Walaja failed to stop the advance. Khalid then continued westward toward the Euphrates, reaching Ullais. There, according to the conquest tradition, another coalition confronted him, including local Christian Arab forces and Persians under a commander named Jaban. The sequence preserved by later Muslim historians shows repeated attempts to construct new defensive lines after earlier positions had failed. This pattern is important because it contradicts the simplified image of a Sassanid Empire collapsing after one battle. Persian resistance was being renewed. What was failing was the ability to create a stable line before Khalid moved around or through it. The fighting at Ullais is also surrounded by one of the most disturbing traditions of the campaign. Later, Muslim sources associate the battle with extensive killing after the fighting and with a vow attributed to Khalid concerning the defeated enemy. The scale, wording, and circumstances are difficult to establish independently, and later accounts should not be treated as direct transcripts of events. But the episode cannot simply be removed because it complicates the conquest narrative. War in Lower Iraq was producing consequences beyond the destruction of field formations. Defeated soldiers could be killed or captured. Settlements could lose protection. Agricultural communities faced new demands from whichever army controlled their district. Existing relationships between local populations, Arab tribal groups, landholders, and Sassanid officials were being forced into rapid renegotiation. Victory did not make those populations politically homogeneous. Some groups cooperated with the advancing Muslims, others resisted. Some negotiated. Decisions could be driven by survival, taxation, local rivalries, religious affiliation, previous connections to Persian authority, or the immediate presence of armed forces. Khalid's westward movement eventually brought him into the vicinity of al-Hira. That was a more serious political result than the defeat of another field army. Al-Hira had been the center of the former Lakhmid kingdom and had long functioned as a major interface between Arabia and the Sassanid imperial system. Its surrender to Khalid in 633, recorded in the later conquest sources, demonstrated that the campaign had moved beyond the outer frontier and into an established political and urban center. Yet even this did not mean Iraq had been conquered. The Sassanid capital at al-Madin remained intact. Large areas of Mesopotamia remained outside Muslim control. Persian armies would continue fighting, and the struggle for Iraq would outlast Khalid's presence there. That is the central significance of Kazima. It was not the battle that destroyed the Sassanid Empire. It was one early engagement in a sequence of operations that exposed a more dangerous problem. Every time Persian commanders tried to restore the defensive line, Khalid's forces were already forcing the war into another district. The empire responded with more troops. The campaign responded by expanding, and before the struggle for Iraq could be settled, Khalid himself would be ordered away from the theater and sent west towards Syria, leaving other commanders to continue a war that was becoming larger than the campaign he had begun. If you're still listening, subscribe for the next campaign, and tell me your city, state, or country in the comments. Then give me your theory. Was the decisive Sassanid weakness military coordination, political instability, or the failure of its frontier system to adapt quickly enough to Khalid's movements?